Welcome to Mayor Brown's International Arbitration Across the Pond podcast. Each episode is designed to provide insight on legal issues and other matters affecting international arbitration in the UK, US and around the world. The podcast is presented by two of Mayor Brown's international arbitration partners, Kwadwo Sarkodie from the firm's London office and Charles Harris from the firm's Chicago office. You can subscribe to this podcast on all major podcasting platforms, as well as Mayor Brown's YouTube channel. We hope you enjoy the podcast.
And good afternoon to all of you. My name's Kwadwo Sarkodie. I'm a partner here in the Mayor Brown International Arbitration team. What I would like to do today is build on some of the experience I've developed working with Chucky, who's in our Chicago office, on some of the issues on arbitration as it's looked at from both sides of the Atlantic. So Chucky, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yes, absolutely. So Charles Harris is my name. My nickname is Chucky. So you can call me whatever you want to. It doesn't really matter to me. I'm a partner in the litigation and dispute resolution practice at Mayor Brown in Chicago, and I'm based in Chicago. And Kwadwo and I worked on a lot of different things over the years, and it's nice to see her and talk to him over his platform.
Excellent. So, Chucky, why don't we start off? I understand you were going to have a few thoughts on COVID-19 and how the restrictions which have come with the pandemic have influenced the landscape for international arbitration.
So before we go to that, Kwadwo, why don't we start off with a little bit about the who, what, where, and why, and talk about why we're doing this, talk a little bit more about our arbitration practices, just to let our audience know a little bit more about who we are before we hit them with the substance.
Sure.
So I consider my arbitration practice a three-headed arbitration practice. And the first head is I'm a practitioner in both domestic and international arbitrations. I'm also a neutral. I've been a neutral for about 5 years, mostly commercial disputes as well as some statutorily based consumer disputes. And I have probably about 25 to 30 arbitrations under my belt now. And also I do a lot of assisting clients with drafting and defending arbitration agreements in court. So what we call filing motions to compel. So that's the three heads. And what about yours?
Don't know if I can boast quite as many heads as you, Chucky. My international practice really comes out of my background as a construction disputes lawyer. So I've been with Mayor Brown and doing construction disputes for something like 16 years. With regard to international construction contracts, it's very commonplace for them to provide for international arbitration, and that's where my international arbitration disputes experience has really grown and developed. So it's rather than sitting as arbitrator, it's as counsel to parties in relation to large, complex disputes, often under the FIDIC form of contract. That over the years has expanded. I've got an extensive practice in relation to international arbitrations as they relate to projects and clients in sub-Saharan Africa. And that has led to experience in commercial arbitrations in various disputes and areas that go beyond the strict construction and engineering sphere, and looking at those from a number of areas. So you mentioned, Chucky, about action in court. Likewise, I've got extensive experience in advising on enforcement of arbitration, various measures that can be taken with regard to the court in connection with arbitration proceedings.
Wonderful. So COVID. So what? Why? So that's the what. I guess the what about us, but also why. Like why we wanted to do this. And I mean, from my perspective, I'm a big podcast fan, and I mean, this is a topic, and when we're talking about international arbitration, just arbitration in general, that I really enjoy and I'm passionate about. So I think and I know you're passionate about it as well. But I thought to myself, look, like why don't we just get together and have a conversation about something we're passionate about and maybe somebody else, maybe our audience might get some benefit from it. So what is your perspective?
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic idea. And when you mentioned that to me first, I thought I'd better go and listen to some podcasts because I'm not as much of a podcast fan as yourself, but certainly since we've been kicking this idea around, I've listened to quite a few and seen how engaging and helpful they can be. And so, absolutely, as you say, Chucky, it's something we like discussing and exchanging views on anyway. And I think it's a great opportunity to do it in a format that can be shared with others.
Absolutely. So COVID-19, you mentioned COVID-19, and how could we start talking about emerging issues in international arbitration and not talk about the effect that the pandemic has had on international arbitrations? I think we would be remiss if we didn't start off with this topic. So what we have seen, or what we saw initially during the first wave, let's call it the first wave of the pandemic, was that a lot of arbitration bodies, international arbitration bodies, so we're talking about the ICC, the ICDR, they published a joint statement. And if I could sum up that joint statement in a few words, I would say the court is open, right? So that's essentially what they're saying. Look, our rules are set up such that they're very flexible, and you can continue to proceed with your cases, even though we're at home and the pandemic is going on and it's affecting everybody's lives. So, I mean, what was your initial thought when you saw this information that these arbitration bodies put out?
Well, to be honest, I wasn't too surprised. I mean, one of the observations I have about international arbitration is that a lot of it naturally lends itself to some of the steps that are being taken now more broadly, and including by the courts. Anyway, I mean, we've seen arbitral institutions for a long time providing for hearings to take place remotely, providing for online platforms for filing and exchange documents and so on. So there are various provisions already within international arbitration, given its cross-border nature, that I think parties have already been forced to confront over the years, which allow for matters and procedures to take place remotely. And so to see that these were being put into further use and available to support parties in these very, very unusual circumstances we're now confronted with the COVID epidemic, hasn't been too much of a surprise. I think we've seen some of the leading institutions show flexibility and a proactive and effective approach on a number of issues, and I think this might be just another example.
Absolutely, and that so I at least want to focus on one of the guidelines that was published, and that was the ICC. So we had this joint statement, but we also had a lot of these arbitration bodies publishing their separate guidelines. And I thought the ICCs were kind of the most comprehensive. So that's why I'll focus on those and just talk about quickly some of the points that they made, just to crystallize what you and I have been saying about the flexibility of rules and about kind of this not being something that is unique or sui generis, what we're going through now, but maybe with regards to virtual hearings, which I'll get to. But let me just go over a few things in the ICC guidance. So the ICC guidance is called the ICC Guidance Note on Possible Measures Aimed at Mitigating the Effects of the COVID-19 Pandemic. And essentially what they're saying is what we've already said, which is that use our tools, which you already have in the rules, in a thoughtful manner to make sure that your cases proceed as they should. And in fact, the ICC says that tribunals and parties, it's your responsibility to do that. It's not, we're not saying that, hey, this is just something you should do, but something you have to do. So just reading some of the considerations that the ICC had published in their guidance, they said, for instance, resolving the issues and dispute in stages by rendering one or more partial awards, when doing so is likely to result in more efficient resolution of the case. So that's one idea of how you can maybe move the case along, or identifying whether the entirety of the dispute or discrete issue may be resolved on the basis of the documents only with no evidentiary hearing. So these are just a few examples they gave of things that parties and tribunals should be thinking about in order to resolve their cases in the amid the pandemic. So any thoughts on those?
Yeah, I mean that's interesting and a comprehensive and positive approach from the ICC. Have you noticed any differences between institutions in some of the approaches they've taken, or are they sort of all broadly seem to be taking a similar line?
Just from my experience in dealing with international arbitrations and several different administrators, I would say that the rules are pretty similar. And I wouldn't say that that's the case for international arbitrations. I would say that's also the case for domestic arbitrations. I think that the playbook is very similar. So I would say that I haven't seen anything particularly unique from arbitration body to arbitration body. And ultimately, remember, I mean, as far as how your case proceeds, is ultimately a decision of the parties, and the arbitrator is generally, if this is reasonable, is going to agree to what the parties want to agree to. And there's ways to fit that in under the rules.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly relevant. I mean, I this morning received notice from the Cairo Regional Centre for Commercial Arbitration, announcing that their offices are temporarily closed as a consequence of the pandemic, and pointing to measures they were proposing in order to keep support for arbitration and the facilities that they provide ongoing. So what they were able to do was point to, and this is a quote from what they sent, but they said that they would draw users and tribunals' attention to the certain provisions of their rules. That included Article 17.3, which provides that hearings can take place on a documents-only basis, and Article 28.4, which provides for witnesses and experts to be examined, and the quote is, through means of telecommunication that do not require their physical presence at the hearing. So that's an example, really, of an institution having those tools in place. And in an instance like this, where it's actually had to close its centre because I think, as I understand it, a couple of their staff have been diagnosed with the virus, it's been able to get that out very quickly to support and encourage parties to continue as usual.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, this sounds like the same thing we're talking about with these other bodies. And I mean, from what I've been seeing, I have. So let's switch gears and talk about virtual hearings, because I think that's important. I think that a lot of these things that we're doing, I mean, generally you when you're talking about case management, all the things that you're talking about for hearing, those things are generally done over the phone. So of course those things can proceed easily through the pandemic. But when you're talking about virtual hearings, you're talking about kind of a different thing. And people are used to doing hearings in person and used to have presenting documents in person and presenting witnesses in person. So that is, I think, a more difficult discussion between the parties and the tribunals, how to do these virtual hearings, which I've had some experience with, which I'll go into. But how to do these virtual hearings how to do a virtual hearing, right? How do you do it? But do you have any thoughts on that, or have you had any experience with that so far?
Oh, well, I mean, interestingly, and this is something where I think the COVID experience is, in some senses, bringing the court practice closer to that of international arbitration, because I've recently done a hearing in a court matter remotely. We've found actually that although it's something that less familiar in the court context, having that experience from international arbitration on both sides of the dispute in that instance helped the parties to adapt to it pretty well, and for it all to be conducted very flexibly and effectively. But I think certainly with issues where there's extensive cross-examination and so on, I imagine that's where challenges arise, because the nature of the practice is just different. In terms of communicating, reading non-verbal cues and so on. There are additional challenges which are presented by doing things remotely and over a video link. And I don't know if you've got any examples from your experience of that.
I do. So I think that my view, the thesis is that if you have a hearing, an actual hearing that is going to be complex, where you're going to have a lot of documents, a lot of witnesses, is just not realistic at this point to do it over some virtual platform. And I have a 5-day hearing in a case. It's a fairly complex case where I'm serving as a chairman, and that was supposed to go to hearing. I think it was back in May, and we moved it back several times. It's now in November, but we had discussed the idea of doing it as a virtual hearing. And I think that given the number of witnesses, the number of people who would need to be in the room, having to have the stenographer, people being a little uncomfortable with questioning the witness over a virtual platform, that we're trying to do everything we can do in order to avoid doing it virtually. And I imagine that a lot of people who are dealing with this same issue are thinking the same thing. Is it really realistic for us to do a entire hearing with multiple witnesses and, like I said, a bunch of documents virtually? And I think it's different from just doing an argument, just you, another lawyer, and a judge, where it's kind of contained and it's just a couple of people. So I think doing a hearing is very different. That's just my thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. There's certainly a number of additional challenges. You know, for my view, although I think it's different in every instance. I think there's potential that it can be done and achieved, but I think it presents a number of additional hurdles that require careful planning and a lot of careful logistical considerations as well. Like you say, you've got multiple parties and multiple moving parts which need to be brought together in quite an unfamiliar context when it's all being done remotely. Another issue that I think clients may be concerned about is cybersecurity when there's and confidentiality more generally. When very large volumes of documentation and information, some of which might be highly sensitive, is being exchanged in the context of a very high stakes dispute. No doubt the conducting matters remotely will give rise to additional security concerns.
Absolutely. And what we've seen is that, and I'm not going to name any names because they need to come hire us when they get sued again. But what we've seen is that some of the virtual platforms that have become the darlings amid the pandemic are now getting lawsuits about cybersecurity, and about privacy, and about kind of giving people false impressions about their ability to protect the content that people were recording on these platforms. So that is something that a party actually raised to me in an arbitration that I wasn't even aware of. So that site security is definitely a significant concern. And in these complex cases, as you said, it makes a lot of parties and a lot of our clients uncomfortable about doing the hearing on this platform, on this type of platform.
Yeah, exactly. And we've all heard the horror stories about people popping up on conference calls and conference lines
Right.
when they're not supposed to, and so on, be it inadvertently or be it a security breach. So I think it's naturally something that gives rise to concern.
Right. So I think we've exhausted this topic. If you don't have anything else to talk about.
Yes, I mean the only other comment I'd like to just throw in is in relation to the Green Arbitration Pledge, and this is the movement we know which has been underway for some years now, and is gathering some momentum in view of trying to reduce the carbon impact of arbitration. Now that's something that's likely to receive a boost from the restrictions around COVID, which are limiting the opportunities for long distance business class travel, which is often a key element of international arbitration, particularly when it gets to hearing stage. And I think it is positive if parties and institutions are gaining increased experience of conducting larger quantities and proportions of these processes by remote means, by electronic exchange of documents, and by remote hearings, and that could be an important impetus to further these the aspirations of making arbitration a more of a green process.
Oh, absolutely, and that's a very good point. And I guess that's a plus about the pandemic, right? It's caused us to think more about how we can do things more efficiently. And I think what you're exactly right. So we talk about the phrase you hear is the new normal. So the new normal is going to be different. And I think people are going to be looking for opportunities to save costs in arbitration, international arbitration. So yeah, that's a very good point, and I completely agree with you.
Yeah, so thank you, and I think if with that wraps up our discussion on COVID. Hopefully, on at least one small positive aspect on what has overall been a pretty negative experience for the world with the impact of the pandemic.
And this has been fun. Our first podcast in this series, and our first podcast ever. And no, it's exciting. And please keep listening, everybody, because we're only going to get better.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you have any suggestions for topics or want to reach Kwadwo, Sarkodie or Charles Harris, you can find them at the Mayor Brown website, mayorbrown.com. Also, to learn more about other Mayor Brown audio programs, please visit mayorbrown.com/podcast. Thank you for listening.